I'm I'm going to try and tell a story, and it involves a friend of mine that I met in 8th grade, 7th or 8th grade. See, what we used to do is we used to sit in the cafeteria during lunch, and somehow we'd end up talking video games. I actually met him in the 4th grade because all of our grade schools were separated. I grew up in a farm, rural, if I could pronounce the word, community, and they built a new school, so all these small local schools got converged, and I ran into kids that lived in 10 to 15 miles, even closer sometimes, of me, but I had no idea who they were because it was a really small school in grade school. But anyway, so we all got converged into this one big classroom when I was in around 4th grade, and that's where I met him. And just a friend of mine. I was a young kid, and obviously that's 4th grade. But really, what happened? Since we kind of had the same interests, I was into Transformers, he was into Transformers, and all the other boys would always bring their Transformers and stuff like that around. And I really didn't have, I didn't bring a lot of my toys to school because I didn't have a lot of money. I was going to bring my toys to school and get, have them get broken. I was always worried about that. I mean, eventually I brought one, but I brought the Masters of the Universe He-Man action figure, a Moss Man to school, and it's just a Transformer. Anyway, so we actually used to play Transformers out on recess, and everyone would pretend they were different Transformers. But I've known this guy, God, my whole life now. But we met in the 4th grade, and what we used to do, and I grew up playing a lot of video games, and I guess I fell in love with playing, the Nintendo. I played the Atari and Intellivision when I was younger, but I played a lot of Nintendo, and since everybody when I was young back in the 80s would play Nintendo, we would sit at lunch and just basically sit there and talk video games throughout the whole lunch period with this really goofy kid named Glenn, who idolized his brother so much, and he would always sit there and talk, and he had really, like a short blonde, scruffy mullet, a lisp, these really thick, sort of bottle glasses, and he would just talk about his brother Brent and playing through The Legend of Zelda and the Labyrinths really well. It was just like a kid. But he wasn't as bad as this kid named Slater, who called himself Mr. Nintendo. And the funny thing is this guy was older. He wasn't like, you would imagine somebody who was really, who would call themselves Mr. Nintendo would actually be, older than that. But, anyway, so we would play a lot of video games, and when I would go home, I would play video games. I remember the first time I was able to beat Mike Tyson's Punch-Out for the Nintendo. And if you've ever played Mike Tyson's Punch-Out from the Nintendo, you would know that Mike Tyson was really hard. He was considered to be very hard back then. And it was a big feat if you could beat him. And I remember the day. I just fought him forever and ever and ever, and I remember the day. And I finally beat him, but it was by decision. You can win the match when you're fighting Tyson. You can win by knocking him out. You can win a technical knockout, which is knocking him down 3 times in a round. Or you can get more points in the match, and you can win by decision. The referee would give you a decision. And I finally was able to last, and I beat him by decision, and no one believed me. I go to school all pumped up to tell everybody, and he didn't freaking believe me. This SOB didn't believe me that I beat Mike Tyson by decision, because he couldn't do it, obviously, But so what I had to do back then is I had to do it again, and then I took with one of those old cameras that you would get, the long ones. I forget what they're called. Remember, it just wasn't disposable, and it wasn't like 35 millimeter. It was those old rectangular cameras. Anyway, I took still shots of the game at the end. And this one isn't like, I feel so old. This wasn't like today where you could take something with the cell phone or a digital camera. I actually had to send these things away and get them back. And it took a while, I mean, to get processing because, I couldn't get my mother to pay for overnight 1-hour film for Mike Tyson. I really didn't see the need. So I finally got the pictures back, and by the time I got the pictures back, he'd beaten Mike Tyson himself. I guess he couldn't take it. But keep in mind, this is also the same guy who had me wandering around playing The Adventure of Link for hours because he told me, and if you haven't played The Adventure of Link, there's a part where you can walk in the overhead map of the game. And what you do, you can have your hammer and you can chop down trees. So the game is set up like this really giant square grid. And you could chop down different trees, and sometimes there'll be things under there. And there's a couple parts in the game where you'll just be walking in the overhead, and the character will just fall into a pit of some sort. Except he told me this story where he was chopping the woods, and he fell into this secret palace. And there's all these things that he did. That he really described the palace in detail. He went into the colors, he went into the look, he went into this special thing that he found. And of course, he couldn't remember where the palace was. And I was like, oh, man, where was it? And he didn't remember. So my stupid face went wandering around, chopping every tree in that game several times, trying to find this thing that this other kid had found. And of course, it didn't exist. So I'm like an idiot. I'm wandering around trying to find this thing. And I actually called the Nintendo Power hotline about it. And I remember calling and asking, and the guy on the other phone basically was like, "Kid, you're an idiot. What the hell are you talking about? There's no..." So it wasn't really until years later that I figured it out that it actually didn't exist. So, but anyway, we would sit at lunch and talk about all of these things. And for years, our friendship was predicated on playing video games. In fact, most of our lives, up until I became an adult, I played a lot of video games. What we would do is we would skip school if there was a new video game coming out, because basically, especially in the 4th grade, I was never there. People were impressed, and if I did show up, I would fake being sick and I would leave early. And the beautiful part of that is that one time that the nurse at my school didn't send me home or wouldn't call my parents, and I was legitimately sick, and my mother called and freaked out on her. So basically, no matter what I did when I would go down to the nurse, she would send me home because my mother yelled at her. So, it's such a point. And I used that. Oh, did I use that? So I went home most of the days in 4th grade. And I would also skip out. It was really awkward. At one point when I was in college, I needed to see a doctor, and I because I have carpal tunnel, I had an operation since then. But I went to see a doctor, and there was the nurse. So here I am, a 20-some-year-old man going to see the doctor, and there was my ex-school nurse who hated me. You could just tell she still had contempt for me because my mother yelled at her like 20 years ago. But anyway, so we would skip school, and the best part of it is, especially if there was a new game coming out, we had codes, because not only would we skip school, but we had to convince our respective mothers that we could stay home. So we'd be like, okay, listen, here's the code. I'm going to call your house, and if I let it ring once and hang up, that means I'm staying home. So we would plan that all the time and do all those different things. And how we, managed to get over each other's house, because you didn't have the internet back then to play. You had to actually go. So what we would either do is either rent the same game, or we would buy the same game and just like talk on the phone all day while we played. It might be why I have neck problems to this day, because I didn't have a headset. I just sat there with the phone, like, as far as I know, with my neck cocked. I'm pretty sure, because now I would never do that. I won't talk without a headset on. So we would do that. There was one time where I was old enough where I could stay home, probably 16 or 17. We stayed home from school, and just for the hell of it, just to play a game. And this woman I was dating at the time decided to, she didn't like that because she didn't see me show up because I had to meet her. She at school every day. And we're sitting there playing a game, and early in the morning, I hear a knock at my door, and there she is, like, trying to ruin my day, trying to come out and then skip school with us. And it's just like, oh my God, can you let me play a game and be a man just once in my life, please? Oh my God, it's horrendous. But yeah, video games are a big part of my life. I'm going to try and tell a story, and it involves a friend of mine that I met in